When I was in my early 20s, I moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of a small town in the Midwest. It was an old building, but the rent was cheap, and it had a certain charm that made it feel like home. I loved the quiet mornings and evenings filled with nothing but the distant hum of passing cars. It felt safe. That feeling didn't last long. I had a neighbor in the unit directly across from mine. His name was Jim, a man in his late 50s who always seemed off. He wasn't overtly creepy, just socially awkward, too many questions about my life, a bit too much lingering in the hall when I came home. But he was friendly enough, always offering to help carry groceries or fix something around the apartment. I chalked it up to small-town hospitality and tried to keep my distance. It started about a month after I moved in. I'd just gotten home from work, my shoes still on, when I heard a soft knock on my door. When I opened it, there was no one there. I stepped into the hallway, confused, and found a small bouquet of wildflowers lying on the floor. There was no note, no indication of who they were from. I assumed it was a neighborly gesture and left them in a glass on my counter. But the next day, it happened again. Another knock, another bouquet, this time accompanied by a short note, "You light up the building." The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike. My first instinct was Jim. He was the only person in the building who'd spoken to me more than a handful of times. I thanked him in passing one day, casually mentioning the flowers, but he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Flowers? Not me," he said with a shrug. His reaction seemed genuine. For the next few weeks, the flowers kept coming. Always the same kind, always left when I wasn't home. The notes became more personal. "You have the most beautiful smile. Your laugh brightens the darkest days." I started to feel uneasy, like someone was watching me. One night, I came home late after dinner with friends. The hallway was dark, and the air felt heavier than usual. As I approached my door, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks, a shadow moving behind my curtains. My apartment was on the second floor, and there was no fire escape or balcony. I froze, my heart racing. I reached for my phone to call the police but realized I'd left it in my car. Slowly, I backed away from the door, careful not to make a sound, and bolted down the stairs to my car. From the parking lot, I could see my living room window clearly. The shadow was still there, pacing back and forth. When the police arrived, they found no one inside. The windows and doors were locked, and nothing seemed out of place. They told me it was probably my imagination, stress from moving to a new place. But I knew what I saw. A few nights later, I woke up to a noise. It was faint, like someone tapping on glass. I sat up in bed, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. Then it came again, louder this time. The sound was coming from the window in my living room. Grabbing the closest thing I could find, a heavy candle holder, I crept toward the noise. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a figure standing just outside the window. My stomach turned. This was the second floor. Whoever, or whatever, it was, shouldn't have been there. I yanked the curtains open, ready to swing, but there was nothing there. Just the empty fire escape, slick with rain. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Things escalated quickly after that. I started finding things out of place in my apartment, small, subtle changes that could have been written off as forgetfulness if they didn't happen so often. A coffee mug that was on the counter would appear in the sink. A picture frame would be tilted on the wall. My bathroom mirror fogged up with a word I couldn't explain, soon. The breaking point came one stormy night. I was curled up on the couch, trying to distract myself with a movie, when the power went out. My apartment was plunged into darkness, and the only light came from the occasional flash of lightning outside. That's when I heard it. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The breathing stopped, replaced by the sound of something heavy scraping against the floor. I scrambled for my flashlight, shining it around the room. For a moment, I saw nothing. But then, in the corner near the closet, the beam of light landed on a figure. It was Jim. He was crouched low, his eyes wide and unblinking. In his hand was a bouquet of wildflowers, wilted and dripping with rainwater. "I just wanted to see you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the thunder. "You're so beautiful." I don't remember much of what happened next. I screamed, threw the flashlight at him, and bolted out of the apartment. I spent the night at a friend's place and called the police the next morning. Jim was arrested later that day. They found a spare key to my apartment in his possession, one he'd stolen from the building's maintenance office. He'd been sneaking into my apartment for weeks, watching me, leaving notes and flowers, and moving things around to unsettle me. I moved out the next day, leaving behind everything I couldn't fit in my car. To this day, I can't hear the sound of tapping on glass without freezing in fear. I often wonder how long he'd been watching me before I even noticed. And what he might have done if I hadn't caught him. A few years ago, I rented a small cabin in the woods for the summer. I'd been feeling overwhelmed by city life, and the idea of spending a couple of months surrounded by nature seemed like the perfect escape. The cabin was charming, wooden beams, a cozy fireplace, and a wraparound porch that overlooked a sparkling lake. The nearest neighbor was a few hundred feet away, their cabin barely visible through the thick line of trees that separated our properties. The first few weeks were idyllic. I spent my days hiking, swimming, and reading, completely unplugged from the chaos of the world. The solitude was exactly what I needed, until I met my neighbor. His name was Henry. He looked to be in his late 40s, with graying hair and an unsettlingly thin frame. He introduced himself one afternoon as I was chopping wood in the yard. At first, he seemed normal enough, friendly but quiet, with a soft-spoken demeanor that made me feel at ease. "You're lucky to have this place," he said, glancing at my cabin. "It's peaceful out here. No one to bother you." I smiled politely, nodding in agreement. "It's perfect. Just what I needed." He chuckled softly, his eyes lingering on me a little too long. "Let me know if you need anything," he said. "I'm just through the trees." I thanked him and watched as he disappeared into the woods. Something about the encounter left me uneasy, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The first strange thing happened a few nights later. I woke up around midnight to the sound of rustling outside my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was an animal, raccoons or maybe a deer, but the sound was too deliberate. It was slow and steady, like footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window, my heart pounding. When I pulled back the curtain, there was nothing there. Just the dark outline of trees swaying in the wind. I stood there for a while, listening, but the sound had stopped. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside my window. They were human, large, with deep impressions like someone had been standing there for a long time. My stomach churned as I followed the trail, which led into the woods toward Henry's cabin. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe someone had wandered through the area by mistake. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the next few weeks, more things started happening. I'd come home from a hike to find the door to the cabin slightly ajar, even though I was certain I'd locked it. My belongings would be moved, small, subtle changes, like a book placed on a different shelf or a mug left on the counter that I hadn't used. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But as the incidents became more frequent, I knew something was wrong. One afternoon, I decided to confront Henry. I hiked through the trees to his cabin, rehearsing what I was going to say. But when I got there, the place looked deserted. The windows were dark, and the door was padlocked. It didn't make sense. I'd seen smoke rising from his chimney just the day before. I asked the owner of my cabin about Henry when I next went into town for supplies. She gave me a puzzled look. "There's no one renting the cabin next door," she said. "It's been empty for months." My blood ran cold. I tried to explain, telling her about the men I'd met, but she insisted I must be mistaken. "Maybe it was someone passing through," she said. "Happens sometimes." But I knew what I'd seen. Henry wasn't a figment of my imagination. And if he wasn't supposed to be there, then who was he? That night, I locked every door and window, barricading myself in the bedroom with a chair wedged under the doorknob. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But deep down, I felt the walls closing in, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of the floorboards creaking. It was faint, like someone trying to move quietly but not quite managing it. My chest tightened as I held my breath, listening. The creaking grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside my bedroom door. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. But before I could hit send, the doorknob rattled. Slowly, deliberately, like someone testing the lock. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The rattling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a low, rasping voice spoke from the other side of the door. "You shouldn't have come here." The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed locked in the room until sunrise, clutching a heavy flashlight like a weapon. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, the cabin was empty. The front door was wide open, and the chair I'd wedged under the doorknob was toppled over. I packed my things and left that morning, not bothering to lock up. I didn't even look back at the cabin as I drove away. The owner seemed surprised when I told her I was cutting my stay short, but she didn't press me for details. I think she could tell I didn't want to talk about it. Months later, I came across an article about the cabins. It was an old story, buried in the archives of a local news site. Years ago, a man named Henry had lived in the cabin next door. He was a recluse, rarely seen in town, but the locals had started to notice strange things happening around the property. Campers would go missing. Hikers reported hearing whispers in the woods. Henry had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a padlocked cabin and a legacy of rumors. Some said he'd moved away. Others believed he was still out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting. I don't know what I believe. All I know is that I never want to see those woods again. And if I do, I'll make sure I'm not alone. When I first moved into my new apartment complex, I thought I had finally found the perfect place. It was a quiet building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and tucked away from the constant noise of the city. My apartment was on the second floor, overlooking the small, overgrown courtyard at the center of the complex. It wasn't fancy, but it was peaceful. Or so I thought. My neighbors were a strange mix of people, most kept to themselves, polite but distant. The only ones who stood out were the couple in the unit below me. They were in their late 30s, maybe early 40s, and they always seemed slightly off. The woman was tall and thin, with dark hair that hung limply around her face, while the man was broad-shouldered and eerily quiet. I never heard them argue or even talk loudly. But sometimes, late at night, I'd hear faint noises coming from their apartment, soft thuds, muffled scraping sounds, and the occasional low hum, almost like chanting. The first time I officially met them was about a week after I moved in. I was on my way up the stairs with an armful of groceries when the woman appeared at the bottom landing. Her sudden presence startled me, her pale face emerging from the shadows like a ghost. "Hi," she said, her voice soft and almost robotic. "I'm Lisa. My husband and I live downstairs." "Oh, nice to meet you," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm Amanda. Just moved in." She nodded, her gaze lingering on me a second too long. "Welcome," she said. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." There was something unsettling about the way she said it, like she wasn't offering help so much as issuing a warning. I thanked her awkwardly and hurried upstairs, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing strange things about the couple. For one, they never seemed to leave the building. I worked from home, so I was around most of the day, and I never once saw them go out to run errands, take a walk, or even check the mail. The only sign of life from their apartment was the occasional flicker of light in their windows at odd hours of the night. One evening, as I was sitting on my balcony, I saw the man, Lisa's husband, standing in the courtyard. He was staring up at my apartment, his face expressionless. I froze, unsure of what to do. He didn't move, didn't wave or call out, just stood there, his head tilted slightly, like he was studying me. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked back inside without a word. Things escalated from there. Late at night, I started hearing noises directly beneath my bedroom floor. At first, it was faint, a rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on a wooden surface. But as the nights went on, the sounds grew louder and more erratic. Sometimes it sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor, other times like heavy objects being dropped. Once, I could have sworn I heard a woman crying. I told myself it was none of my business, that I should just ignore it. But the noises didn't stop. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard a loud crash that made my whole apartment shake. I bolted upright, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and typed out a message to the landlord, but before I could hit send, I heard something else, footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving up the stairs outside my apartment. They stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, staring at the shadow of feet visible under the doorframe. The shadow didn't move for what felt like hours. Then, without a sound, it disappeared. The next morning, I decided to confront Lisa. If there was something going on in their apartment, I wanted to know. I knocked on their door, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. Lisa answered after a few moments, her face as blank and emotionless as ever. "Hi," I said, forcing a smile. "I've been hearing some strange noises at night. I just wanted to check if everything's okay." Her expression didn't change. "We're fine," she said, her tone flat. "Oh, okay. Well, if there's anything I can do." She nodded and started to close the door, but something caught my eye, a glimpse of the apartment behind her. It was dark, the only light coming from a small lamp on a table. The furniture was sparse and outdated, but what stood out most was the large wooden chest sitting in the middle of the living room. It looked old, almost antique, with metal latches that gleamed in the dim light. Before I could say anything, Lisa shut the door. That night, the noises were worse than ever. The tapping, the dragging, the faint sounds of crying, it all felt closer, like it was happening just on the other side of the wall. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs, determined to figure out what was going on. When I reached their door, I hesitated. What was I even going to say? But before I could knock, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. A faint light spilled out into the hallway, and from inside, I could hear a low, murmuring sound. "Hello." I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The apartment was just as dim and sparsely furnished as I'd seen before. The wooden chest still sat in the center of the room, but now the latches were undone, and the lid was slightly open. The murmuring sound was louder now, coming from somewhere deeper in the apartment. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with a strange, metallic smell that made my stomach churn. As I moved further in, the murmuring stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, coming from the chest. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was inside could sense I was there. I wanted to turn around, to run, but something compelled me to move closer. When I reached the chest, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the lid, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Slowly, I lifted it. The chest was empty. Before I could process what I was seeing, the apartment door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls. Lisa and her husband were standing there, their faces eerily calm. "You shouldn't have come here," Lisa said, her voice low and steady. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What are you doing?" Her husband stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the doorway. "It's not safe," he said, his tone almost gentle. "Not for you." I backed away, my mind racing. The scratching sound had stopped, replaced by a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like the apartment itself was alive. "You need to leave," Lisa said, her eyes locked on mine. "Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I shoved past them, bolting out the door and up the stairs to my apartment. I locked the door behind me and called the police, my hands trembling as I tried to explain what had happened. When the officers arrived, they found nothing unusual. The couple's apartment was empty, no chest, no strange smells, no sign of Lisa or her husband. It was as if they had never existed. I moved out the next day, leaving everything I couldn't carry behind. I never found out what was in that chest, or where Lisa and her husband went. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint tapping on my walls, as if whatever I heard in that apartment wasn't finished with me yet.